Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We will go ahead and get started. I'm Sarah Halter. I am the Executive Director of the Indiana Medical History Museum. Before we get to this afternoon's program, I have just a couple of things that I want to let you know about. First, if you're not already, I hope you'll follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're very active there, and you'll find a lot of interesting and relevant articles, photos, links to digital content on our website, and a lot more. And speaking of our website, I hope you'll visit it. We're at imhm.org. There you can see what's going on at the museum, learn about our ongoing preservation efforts for the old pathology building, and find out about new programs and new content as those are available. You can also sign up for our email list there to be the first to know when programs and project updates are announced. You can apply to become a volunteer if you want to be involved at the museum in a more hands-on kind of way. And if you want to become a member or make a donation to support this and other really cool projects, exhibits, and programs, like our work to identify and memorialize the patients buried in Section 1 of Central State Hospital Cemetery, you can make a tax-deductible gift securely right there on our website. Your support in any amount really makes a big difference. And thank you to all of you who are already generous supporters of the museum. None of the important work we do is possible without you. And in fact, you're a critical part of the team. So we're very grateful for your continued support. So now, without further ado, let's get on to the program. This has been a strange year for sure in many ways, and the world of racing is no different. We originally planned this program for much earlier in the year, but circumstances, of course, prevented us from doing it. The Indiana Medical History Museum isn't far from Speedway and the track, and the entire area around us is always bustling and loud during the whole month of May. Whether you're a race fan or not, when you live or work on the west side of Indy, the 500 is everywhere. I grew up with the track almost in my backyard, and that's not much of an exaggeration. And now I work nearby, so I know that even if you're not an active participant, you just can't help but notice the excitement and all the festivities and be affected by them. May is also usually an exciting month for us at the museum because it's one of our busiest months in terms of visitation and programs. So this year, not only were we close to the public, but there was also kind of a strange, eerie silence in the area. We didn't see the usual crowds of excited people walking down 16th Street with their coolers on our way to work. We didn't have to plan our routes carefully to avoid close streets and long lines of cars trying to turn into the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And we didn't hear the constant hum of cars racing around the track at high speeds. All of that excitement was missing. Of course, the race hasn't been completely lost. It's taking place 2 weeks from today, but with no fans in the stands for the first time ever in its long history. I know that a lot of people are very disappointed. But it's all kind of fascinating. We're living in this moment, this huge historic event is happening around us that will be remembered by all of us and studied by historians for a very long time. And this year, with so much disruption and the track empty, all of this will become a part of the medical history of racing that Norma Erickson has spent years studying and appreciating. But today, it's a very different story that we'll hear from her. Norma Erickson is a medical historian and also our education manager at the Indiana Medical History Museum. She has a very long history with us in various capacities going back to 2004. She's been here longer than me even. She's a graduate of IUPUI with bachelor's degrees in religious studies and general studies with a concentration in math and science, and a Master of Arts in U.S. history. Her thesis focused on African American healthcare in Indianapolis at the turn of the 20th century. Previously, she worked as an analyst in clinical, forensic, criminal justice, and athletic drug testing laboratories. And most recently, she was managing editor of a Journal of Humanities and Arts Computing, and the assistant managing editor of the forthcoming digital version of the Encyclopedia of Indianapolis for the Polis Center at IUPUI. She is the author of Ted Hartley, A Half-Century Behind the Wheel in Racing Cars magazine, and also Extending Helpfulness, Carl G. Fisher's Philanthropy to African Americans in Traces of Indiana and Midwestern History. She has given many public talks over the years on a variety of topics, and she regularly presents at academic history conferences. And we're delighted to have her with us today to present the second in her series on the Indianapolis 500's chief medical officers and the connections between medicine and racing, which are truly pretty fascinating and significant, whether you're a hardcore fan of racing or not. So thank you, Norma. I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you all for joining this second in the series of talks about the chief medical officers of the Indianapolis 500. Last year, we started with H.R. Allen, and this year we're going to move on to the second officer, E. Roger Smith. One of the reasons why I do this is I agree with a quote that driver Alex Zanardi writes in the foreword for this book, Rapid Response, where he speaks about the doctors that are on the safety crew and take care of the drivers. And he says that they do have so much love and passion for their work. And in a way, quote, it's sad to think that they get recognition only during tragic circumstances. And that is so true. Most of these people were very important in their professions and in their medical specialties, and were even on the faculty at the Indiana University School of Medicine. So I think it's good that we remember them and talk a little bit about their accomplishments. The title of this is taken from an article that was about Smith in the newspapers in 1939. That was the first line of the thing, when fate overtakes a race driver, and then it went on to talk about the different aspects of what Roger's infield hospital would be, and that he would not only take care of drivers, but also fans who had come to attend the race. Most of the sources that I used were from the newspapers at the time, the Indianapolis Star, Indianapolis News, some medical journals to talk about Dr. Smith's other work that he did outside of the Speedway, and a little bit from this book, Gentlemen, Start Your Engines by Wilbur Shaw. I use it a lot. So let's begin with E. Roger Smith. The title, When Fate Overtakes a Race Driver, actually came from the newspaper. And this is what it said, that when someone cracks up, you need the doctor. And this was the second year that Dr. E. Rogers Smith was the chief surgeon. The last part of this little blurb said, like all sporting fans, he prefers that the race be run without an accident. And that disclaimer, if you want to call it, ends up being throughout the years. Every year, the newspaper runs an article, what's the hospital like? What's it going to be like for the medical staff? And there's always the little almost talisman like, and we hope we never use them. And let's recap. Last year, we did the first chief medical officer, Dr. H.R. Allen. That's him under the red arrow, and it's about the only picture I could find of him. He was associated with the National Surgical Institute. This building was in downtown Indianapolis. His father started it. He continued on, and he was an orthopedic surgeon. He specialized in fixing and working on prosthetics, amputations, and then also any sort of crippling situations, perhaps being born with clubfoot or something like that. And he was a good friend of Carl Fisher's. And he also was on the faculty at Indiana University School of Medicine, where he taught orthopedic surgery, excuse me. And looking back again, these are some of the medical issues that Dr. Allen had to deal with during his tenure, which lasted until 1937. So in 1914, he always did exams on people, on drivers. He had to disqualify Ray Gahuli because his vision was bad. But the AAA, which was the sanctioning body for racing at that time, overruled him and let him run. He did check blood pressure, heart, and lungs before qualifying runs. And in 1933, he disqualified Hattie Wilcox for diabetes and had to be replaced by Maury Rose. Diabetics could not really regulate themselves very well at that time. They didn't have all the tools that are available now. And there was always a fear that someone would pass out or something while they were driving. So he was disqualified. And the drivers put up a stink about that. They threatened that they weren't going to run the race, but Dr. Allen stood his ground and he did not run. And based upon some of the things that he saw, not only at Indianapolis, but at other racetracks, was that there needed to be something to protect the abdomen. And one of the things that he did was devise an abdominal protector. Eddie Rickenbacker mentioned that the drivers used to bind themselves with cloth, wrap themselves almost like a mummy to tighten themselves up, because when they bounced around in the race car, it was very hurtful. These are some of the things Dr. Allen had to deal with during his time, so far as injuries, not medical situations: skull fractures, lots of broken bones, cuts, burns, crushing injuries. And in 1937, he retired. Dr. E. Rogers Smith took over from 1938 to 1951. Dr. Smith was born at Richmond State Hospital, which was one of the chain of mental hospitals that was built around Indiana in the late 19th century, 19th century, His father was Dr. Samuel Rogers, and he was the superintendent at Richmond. And so that's why he was born there. And he was named for Dr. Joseph Rogers, who was also in charge of institutions and was the one that actually built Richmond, Logansport, and Evansville hospitals. So he was named for Dr. Rogers. He received his bachelor's from IU in 1914, went to Michigan for medical school. He did his residency in Boston, and I didn't note this here, but of course it was 1918. He was in the Army then, because he was straight out of medical school and into Army. So residencies both at Boston and at Johns Hopkins. And then when that was all over, he moved to Indianapolis in 1922. He was a neuropsychiatrist, president of its state association. He taught at IU, as did Dr. Allen. A neuropsychiatrist, we don't hear that term very often anymore, if at all. You might hear the term neuropsychologist. This would be a physician that would specialize in treating cases of people who had a neurological disorder that also affected their behaviors. An example of this might be Alzheimer's, sometimes epilepsy when depression was involved, or something like that. So not just something that involved the nervous system alone, but also how it affected a person's behavior or mental health. And because of his expertise in this, he was often court-ordered to provide mental examinations in criminal cases. He was often in the newspapers. When you do a search on him, he pops up all over the place because he was the court-ordered physician for many cases in Indiana. And he famously said that 9 out of 10 cases of insanity are really cases in the heads of the defense attorneys. It really wasn't something that would happen. Only 1 in 10 was true criminal insanity. And he started on the Speedway medical staff in 1924, so very early. He was there for a long time before he became the chief medical officer. He was very popular. As I said, he was in the newspaper a lot so far as his forensic psychiatry cases, but he also had lots of witty remarks, and the newspapers just found him funny. Here's an example of one. Western Union turned down a birthday greeting from Dr. Smith tried to send it to one of his medical friends and said it wasn't fit to transmit. The message, quote, "Congratulations, you lewd, lascivious, lecherous, licentious old goat. May you have many more of the same." "What's wrong with that?" protested Doc. "Get out your dictionary and look up every word." Western Union did and allowed it to be transmitted. He also, in cases, the attorney would ask him what his credentials were, what made him an expert, or he said, "Well, I was born in a mental institution and I grew up in one." So he was a commenter that people did seek out because he had lots of interesting and different takes on this, although very conservative, I think. And his friends just called him Raj. He had a son, too, that was Roger Smith, or is Roger Smith. When I did my research, this is all newspaper research and some medical journals, and I did not interview anybody from his family or anything like that. So that's a missing part of good research, but that's what we have here today. So when he becomes the chief medical officer in 1938, we're going to go through a few of the years here now and see some of the injuries that he had to deal with. Now, the injuries here are incomplete because some of these are mostly just ones that happened during the 500-mile race. But of course, there were always practice sessions where people were injured and even test sessions that may not be part of this research right now. But certainly in 1938, he had to deal with, again, broken bones, concussions, burns, concussions, and a spinal fracture. Those were the 4 years that he was the officer before the break of World War II. And during World War II, then he served again. He was in the Army during his residency in World War I, but then in World War II, he was in the Navy. And he served at all the places that you see there on the right. And this was a little something from the newspaper. 205 local doctors were in the armed forces during World War II, and even the interns and residents. And for this reason, the IU School of Medicine cranked out 2 medical school classes a year for a couple of the years during World War II to keep up with the demand, either on the home front or in combat. When it was all over, he addressed the American Medical Association about combat fatigue. And that was not a new occurrence. They knew that happened, but he felt, and he could say, because he was also serving during World War I, that the World War II combat fatigue was different. The soldiers went under some more relentless psychological torture than they did during World War I. So moving on to the years after the war, again, head injuries, chest, skull fractures. In 49, we see a mention of there being transfusions for one of the drivers. In 1951, I didn't find any injuries. So those are some examples there. So why was he chosen as the heir to Dr. Allen's position? I do not know. I cannot find that, why there might be any particular reason that a neuropsychiatrist would be any better than an orthopedic surgeon to take the position. When you look at the casualties in 1916 for Dr. Allen, they're not a whole lot different than what they were through the 30s and 40s when Dr. Smith was there. So perhaps it was because of his longevity on the team. Perhaps it was leadership, because he would have a very large 60 doctors, 250 nurses, and other people at the track helping out. So, you know, perhaps it was just his team building skills. And when we talk about the injuries, the cars had not changed all that much from when Dr. Allen was the officer, and then, because this is the winning car in 1951. So the driver sets up very high, exposed, not much around them. Same type of injuries. So perhaps from a team building standpoint, this is something that was helpful to have someone like Dr. Smith as the officer. And Wilbur Shaw talked about his injuries in 1941 and spoke about the team that worked on him, his strategic team, because he hit the wall, backed into the wall actually, and the gas tank behind him broke his back. And Dr. Everin Hahn was the neurosurgeon that took care of him besides Dr. Smith. And then Charles Thompson was an orthopedic surgeon. So between these people, he was able to recover because he was actually paralyzed for a short while from the waist down. So they were able to get him back up and running and, of course, racing again. One of the things Dr. Smith is known for is not just fixing people who had gotten hurt, but wanting them to keep from getting hurt. And after he retired in 1951, he was given an award from the 100-mile-an-hour club. It used to be like a real big thing to go over 100 miles an hour. These people gave him an award, and it mentioned in his obituary that Smith was credited with pioneering a safety program emphasizing belts, helmets, and flame-resistant uniforms for drivers. I don't know that he got very far with seat belts because they didn't use those for a long time. Helmets had already been in use for some time. They were mandatory, I think, after 1935 or 36 at the 500. And the flame-resistant uniforms for the drivers was important. One other thing that I just found amazing was Wilbur Shaw won in 1937, and heat is always a problem during the race. I mean, you know how hot it is to sit in the stands. Well, can you imagine in the cars with, even though you're going with open cockpit, you got an engine right there, it's pretty hot. But Wilbur Shaw stuck his helmet in the refrigerator that held the milk for the winner to drink after the race. So his head was cool for a while. And in 1938, when the race started, there were 33 Norge refrigerators sitting at the starting line, so all the drivers could have their helmets refrigerated before the race. Fire prevention. During his time, there were some very spectacular fires. This is a very, very famous one. Duke Nayland in the Novi, wrecked in 1949, ended up backing into the wall. Was probably on fire even before he hit the wall, but he had to hop off, out, go over the wall, and he was badly burned, but he survived. This is another crash. This is 1939. This particular car we're going to see again in the next one, but this was a Miller that had a very strange design. This is George Bailey. He drove the Miller, and the pods there on the side is where the fuel tanks were, right on the side of the car. And so when he crashed, his gas tanks exploded. And he may not have been driving gasoline. It wasn't purely gasoline they were driving, using at the time. Some cars did use methanol or alcohol or a blend, but at any rate, it was extremely flammable. And that caused his demise. The drivers had a meeting either after Seymour or after this wreck to decide whether they would ever let this car run again, because twice it had been a big problem. And this is from 1950. This is Jim Travers, and you can see that his hands are all wrapped up there. He's reading the newspaper the day after. He was involved in a pit fire in Maury Rose's car, 1950. Now, there was some prevention that was available for the drivers at that time. And even though good fire suits didn't come along until the 1960s when Nomex was invented, they still had things they could do. And one of the things they did was soak their clothes in boric acid solution. And this would at least retard the flames and help flames not spread, the fire not spread. And the drivers were given the option to use this solution before the race, before the 1950 race, but they didn't all do that. And they didn't ask it for the mechanics. And the mechanics, they were pretty much exposed for a very long time. As I recall, it was Rick Mears' pit fire in the 90s that really was when the mechanics had to suit up too. But this person, and I sure hope this works, this is a little video, thanks to my daughter, she clipped this for me. This is from a site called Gable in Indy, and we're just gonna look at part of it, and I hope it doesn't stall. And going back to, I actually saw the clip before I read about this guy. And his story, he was all embarrassed because his pants caught on fire and he had to take his pants off right there in front of the pits in front of everybody because it's burning. So when I saw that, I thought, well, I wonder if this is the same wreck. And it is, and you can actually see him running back to the car after he took his pants off. Now, okay, there we are in the pits. There comes the fire. Ooh, squirt, squirt. Out jumps Rose. And coming in from the left, you're going to see somebody coming in that looks like they're in Bermudas. Oh, look, the car's still moving. Coming in his boxer shorts. There he comes. And then he puts something on the top there. And I guess he closed off some valve, which actually made it not be so bad. And now Rose hops back in. Time to go. That's whoa racing. Now this next part, you're going to see, I'm going to stop it actually if I can. This is not a real race car. It's a real race car. But this is actually Clark Gable. This is from the movie To Please a Lady, which is my favorite racing movie. And he was Mike Brannon, and it had a whole story. And so that was the year Clark Gable, when Hollywood came to the Speedway. We'll turn the strange music back on. Studio shot. So when you think about what, whoa, stop. I knew I'd messed this up somehow. I want to go to the next one. There we go. Okay, so in 1946, he was looking at asbestos as a possible driver's uniform. This is a photograph that had absolutely nothing about it in it. I can't find it, I don't know why, but this is an Army, this actually came out of the Army. That's a major there with him. And then we already talked about boric acid. That would be a retardant. And then he resigned after the 1951 race. The Hallmans, which had bought the track after the Second World War, owned a brewery, and they wanted to print the beer. So they had a free beer tent down by the South Chute. And Dr. Smith said there were just too many cases he had to deal with that shouldn't have been there. Doctors shouldn't have to treat drunks. And so he just quit, which is what he would do whenever he was in a situation. I found other panels and things he was on, councils. If things weren't going right, he would quit and be very loud about it. He would pull no punches. Dealing with fate. You know, the first title of Dr. Allen's talk was Surgery and Shenanigans, very lighthearted title. And this one, When Fate Overtakes a Driver, is much more somber. And certainly between the years, between Dr. Allen's first years and there, certainly a lot had happened. So how do people deal with fate, especially when they're always dealing with danger, or even when it's not danger? Life is uncertain a lot of times. And there's fatalism, which a lot of drivers admitted that they believed that when their number was up, it was up. But certainly when their number did come up, having a doctor around like Dr. Smith was a good thing. Statistics, the odds, playing the odds. Could it happen to me? Up until when we got up to 1939, I think there had been 23 different winners of the race. And by that time, 40% of those winners were dead and had been killed in racing accidents. So the statistics weren't very good. So I do find the superstition comes in a lot, and I'm not going to dwell on that today at all, except to say that when we talk about fate and being overtaken, it is certainly something that draws people and makes them feel a little more comfortable. And originally, let me go back up. When I first look at these in the newspaper articles, there's always some little sprinkling of a mentioning about a superstition, and early on, it almost always dealt with the number 13. It also had to do with hoodoo. And these were all things that came from baseball and other sports, different superstitions. But then over time, by the time you get to the 30s, there are other things that have happened. Different drivers had done different things that all became part of legend and lore. And that's where the doctors fit in too. They are definitely a part of the color, the drama of the race. But some superstitions are just not even explainable. Lee Wallard, who won in 1951, carried the dime that was in the shoe when Ted Horn got killed at DuQuoin and thought that was his lucky piece. I would not think that was lucky, but he did, and he won. So superstition will be something that I'll probably cover another time, or at least keep watching for as this series goes on. So when we deal with fate, we deal with things, we deal with uncertainty. How do we do that? I'm going to show you a couple pictures. This is the speedrome last night. In the middle of our pandemic, this is not quite 25%, which is what the crowds are supposed to have, and you don't see many masks. Of course, it's not a good up-close picture, but these people are not worried about fate overtaking them. You go to Sturgis, which is going on right now, motorcycle rally. That's their motto, ride free, take risks. We'll see what happens with that. And if those people need medical care after that too, to deal with if fate overtakes them. And as always, my programs are shorter than what they're supposed to be. Here's a caricature of Dr. Smith. And next up will be C.B. Bonner or Bonner. By next year, I promise I'll know how to pronounce his name correctly. So I will stop there. And if there's questions or discussions, we can move on to that.
Thank you, Norma. We do have a couple of questions. One of them is from Kathy Hull, and she,
I can't.
You kind of touch on the risks that fans are taking now. So this kind of ties into that. But she asked, were all of the injuries those of drivers, or were the pit crew or fans in the audience or in the snake pit treated as well?
Yeah, some of those that were in that list were spectators. There have been quite a few that have been killed or injured over time. In 1939, I think it was 39 or 40, when Floyd Roberts crashed in the southeast turn. Part of the guardrail flew and hit a woman and broke both of her legs. And if she hadn't taken her 6-year-old daughter and turned her to the side, she would have been hurt too. And pit crews, yeah, they took care of everybody. And that was always part of what they wanted to be done there, was because it becomes the size of a city, a large city, for one day, and you would have heart attacks and all kinds of stuff goes on, bee stings, and of course cut feet from beer bottles and things like that. So they would treat everybody.
What about outside of the track? So it's, it's not just one day, as far back as I can remember, one day, and there are people everywhere doing silly things. What about sickness, disease, injuries, sort of affecting the fans outside of the track itself?
Yeah, I don't know how that would have been dealt with. And I'm still trying to find out exactly what was going on during the 1918-19 pandemic in regard to the community and the track, because the race resumed in 1919, and that was when there was another surge of the Spanish flu. So I have not found that yet.
There's another question about whether drinking was a big part of the fan culture back then too, and the free beer tent, I think.
Yeah. Well, I have a feeling it was even before the beer tent, but I think it must have made it worse for Dr. Smith to actually see it there like that. It's so funny, that same year in the society section of the newspaper, there was a woman talking about what was going on in the grandstands with the society people's box seats and stuff. And that person mentioned that there were 185 people treated, but only one of them was drunk. So I don't know whether Dr. Smith was overstating things or the lady in the stands was in the kids section or something. I don't know. But certainly it was. And of course, one of the famous stories from before was that Jules Gou, the French winner in 1913, drank champagne all during the race when he came in on his pit stop. So there's some dispute over how much champagne he drank and all that, but I think it's a lovely story. Anyway, vive la France.
Let me check the chat here again. There's nothing else there, but I did have one question. I wondered, you mentioned about the superstitions, and I'm wondering, were the physicians or anyone, with the medical staff, were they trying to quell those at all, or sort of debunk those kinds of ideas, or were they just sort of like, ignoring it, or hopefully they weren't participating?
Yeah, I really can't say. I didn't see anything about how the doctors felt about that. Yeah, but certainly a lot of drivers had it. Even the people who didn't say they were superstition would go ahead and talk about something that was clearly superstition. Wilbur Shaw lost his shoes. He always wanted to wear those shoes. Not that I'm superstitious, but I feel better with them on. And if that's not a superstition, I don't know what is. He felt protected, not just better, he felt protected. So I don't know how the doctors go, but that's certainly a research question that could be looked at.
I wonder if it was more of like a security blanket for him.
There were many things. There were lots of really, not just prohibitive things, but things you had to do. Not like you just had to have your rabbit's foot, but you couldn't let a woman touch your car or sit in your car or something like that. So there were a lot of them.
Let me check the chat one more time. I think that might be everything. So this is your last chance in the audience if you have a question or want to say anything. All right, well, thank you all for coming. Check out our website. We'll have more events posted there. Sign up for our email list and you'll be the first to know about new things, and we will see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.